Hey everyone, it's Johnny from Jettle, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. I'm joined by Diana, who last year actually came first in biology. Hi Diana. First in biology, 98%, received an ATAR of 99.3, so she's done incredibly well. Diana, thank you so much for being on here with us, and I look forward to hearing your tips and tricks for all of those watching.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. It's such a pleasure. And let's get straight into it, shall we? I mean, now you're at university, but if we rewind the clock, or rather, even if you look back now at your experience of the HSC, just give us a brief description of what that looks like, especially now that you're outside of that experience. What is it like to look back at it? And have you kind of changed your perspective about anything since finishing the HSC?
I guess looking back on it, I definitely kind of realized just how much it took out of us, especially with like the year that we had, like COVID and lockdowns and online learning. Like it was just very much a stressful time. And like kind of looking back on it as well, just like kind of seeing what an achievement it was even to just like get through the HSC and like get through year 12.
Yeah, there's an incredible resilience that's required, especially when you go through something like a pandemic. I mean, I can't even relate to that, so I feel so bad for everyone in your year. But I also, in some ways, I'm kind of like happy for you in that you have gone through something that's really challenging, unquestionably, and now you've actually built that resilience to then take into the world outside of the HSC, right? So, there's pros and cons, depends how you look at the experience. But when it was quite difficult, and I imagine, especially when you were having to learn from home and you had a very kind of scattered routine and there was sport called off and you just kind of had to study in your room, what was kind of keeping you going? What was your motivation personally? Because I know this is different for everyone, but what were a few of the things for you that kept you going, and what did you do to keep yourself disciplined and keep that study routine up if you did?
It was a lot of kind of maintaining a balance in terms of kind of doing as much like study as possible while also kind of keeping exercise and like keeping hobbies and communication with like friends and people, just kind of maintaining that balance when I was feeling like quite stressed or exhausted, like going for a walk or like taking some time off my studies, like taking days off when I needed, just to kind of keep myself in that headspace of like, it's possible, I can do this, like it's going to be okay. And I guess looking forward to like graduation and like the end of school and like I guess summer and like the holidays, like having that as a kind of motivation that kept me going through.
Yes, of course. And I was going to say on that with, graduation and things like that. So were there any other things that you kind of kept turning your mind to? Like, did you have ambitions for after school? I mean, I know you've gone straight into uni here, but were you thinking there was a particular holiday? I don't know if it was like schoolies or something. Like, were there any things that, especially as you got close to the end of the HSC, that you kept thinking about to keep you kind of going?
Definitely like kind of like an after school like trip. I went to Byron with my friends. Like I guess just having that sort of freedom like in itself was a motivation. Formal graduation, like being able to see friends outside of a school context, like just kind of having that idea, that central tenet of like freedom in a way, like freedom from that stress of the HSC, like freedom from like that academic worry, like.
Yeah, that's great. And in terms of when you were at school, what were some of like the key things that you employed, or whether they were like systems that you had in place? But we talked about motivation and thinking forward. But what about when you actually were doing your study and you were actually trying to achieve your academic goals? What kind of routines did you employ to make sure that you were going to hit those targets?
Yeah, so what I did was as soon as possible, like after my classes, I would try and take notes, like read from the textbook, like cover what we did in class in terms of slides, and then get onto consolidation and content related questions just to make sure that I understood what we were talking about and like was able to apply it to different settings and different contexts. And like with that, I was kind of looking for a lot of examples, like thinking, how can I like kind of boost my responses or like bolster them in a way that like made them more convincing and like kind of created a solid argument. Doing chapter reviews, like practice responses when it kind of got closer to the HSC period, like talking with teachers, just kind of surrounding myself with just content and breaking that up and like where I needed to work on, like giving time to that. And yeah, just a lot
Yeah,
of like consolidation.
amazing. Yeah, it sounds like you really immersed yourself in that learning process, which is actually great to hear. In terms of that teacher consultation and reviewing things, asking questions, like kind of really being in it. That's probably the most authentic way and the most effective way really to learn something properly, right? Because sometimes you can just cram things in and remember it for the exam and then be done with it. But when you actually immerse in that process of learning something, asking questions about it, being able to teach it maybe to someone else in kind of like a peer group, I don't know if you had that, but those things all really help. Was that something you had with those kind of like peer groups, and you shared your responses and helped each other? Describe that setup if you had one.
Yeah, it was a lot of like in maybe after class, like talking about it with friends, being like, oh, like this is what we're doing, just kind of trying to jog my memory. Even at home, like talking, as weird as it sounds, like talking like through my notes, like trying to explain it and articulate it in a cohesive way, just so that when it came down to an exam time, I kind of knew what I was going to write and how I was going to kind of put it down on paper, just applying like what we did in class in terms of notes, like in a verbal way, like in a even like flow charts, just putting it down in different ways, like with different people saying, does this make sense? Like, how could I make this like more succinct or more like cohesive?
And were you someone who from the outset was doing this application, or were you, I mean, you sound like that, but some people of course put more weight on, you know, pre-trials and pre-HSC study. But how important was it, if it was at all, in, you know, keeping your notes up to date? Like, was that something you did from day dot when you started the year? Like, walk us through the biology kind of study process. What was the system that worked for you?
So I kind of learnt the hard way in year 11 that it was important to keep constantly doing your notes, like especially after class. Like, you don't want to be like banking up your notes just before trials, because that just creates like a lot of unnecessary stress, and it definitely takes a toll and takes up a lot of your time. So what I found was kind of doing my notes, whether it be in class or outside of class, reading from like textbooks. We used Ed Rollo as well, and that was a major help, especially like after classes when I could, like doing like questions, that practice responses, particularly relating to like the specific dot points we were doing. I broke up my notes as well into not only modules, but inquiry questions, and then using a lot of tables and putting it down in dot points, so that when I found that, say, I was struggling with a particular dot point or inquiry question, or I thought maybe like I don't understand this as well as how I would like to, like kind of giving more time to that, like doing more questions, like focusing on a specific like module or dot point or inquiry question. And then when it came down to doing practice exams, looking at those like exemplar responses and like the markers solutions, and kind of using those to not only gain examples and ways in which I could like write down the content or discuss the content, but also for structure, particularly with extended responses, because there's like a specific kind of structure that really helps with making the content succinct and cohesive, and also applying it to different content.
Absolutely. And please do elaborate on that structurally with those extended responses, with those longer answers. Any practical tips you can give to students listening to this? Like, what were the ins and outs of that structure?
The kind of best piece of information I could give is always defining the terms that are within the question. Say it's like a question on genetic technologies, like offering a definition of what is a genetic technology, and then providing an example of a genetic technology, and then using that example to go in depth into what the question is asking you and how the content you've studied and the examples you've studied relates to that question. Because especially with the exams, I found, especially with our exam, it was a lot more about like application of the content rather than just using the content, especially with the extended response we did. So it's a lot of definitions just to show the like examiner that you understand what's being discussed, like using scientific terminology, and then using that to kind of delve deeper into what you're talking about. And it also like reinforces your understanding and really solidifies, like it creates a solid argument.
Yes. And would that be something you would do in the introduction? Like, would you split up your paragraphs? Like, just walk us through where you're doing each of these things, and what were the key points as well within those bodies if you had them?
I definitely did the definitions like at the very beginning. Like the first thing I would do is the definition. Like going back to that genetic technologies example, I would say like genetic technologies are da 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 da. For instance, say it was gene therapy. Gene therapy is an example of this, wherein da 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 da. One such example of gene therapy is, and then going into like an application of gene therapy, whether it be like cystic fibrosis, and then explaining that and then relating it back to the question.
Got it. And was that in the body paragraph? Was that in a paragraph after you were saying you go into each example?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like breaking it up into paragraphs is like a major, like it helps significantly with just kind of making the content cohesive and like making it kind of visibly like cohesive for the marker.
Absolutely, and you don't want to overwhelm the marker, right? So, a short introduction, I imagine, with those definitions, then going into each of the examples. Now, how many of those would you have, and how long approximately? I know this does vary student to student, but how long would you say yours would have been for each paragraph?
I think it also depended on how many marks the response was. For our exam, it was a 9-mark response, and it was relating to like a particular scenario. So what I remember doing was going into like the genetic technology used for that particular scenario, and then providing, I think it was 2 other examples of genetic technologies, and then relating them back to that original question and the original scenario that we were given. I'm trying to think of like a solid allocation, maybe like 1 every 3 marks. But
so with like a 7 marker, even you might do 2 body paragraphs as well, and then would you have a short, like 2 or 3 for 7 to 9 markers, because you're going to get at least 2 of those, as far as I understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And make sure that they're in depth as well. Like maybe like doing multiple that aren't as in depth, or like a couple that are really solid and really in depth.
Great. And was there a conclusion? Do you have a concluding sentence? Like, what do you think people, if you did, and then what do you think people waste time on after you answer that?
I think definitely having like a concluding statement, just to kind of say, furthermore, like this reflects, and like just kind of to show that the question like has been answered and you have like argued the question in a way. I feel like for a lot of questions as well, a lot of time is wasted on just writing. I know that kind of goes against what I was saying before, but for a lot of questions, what I would do is dot points or breaking it up in a table, just to kind of make it easier to get down information and kind of make it more accessible in a way, or make it like more cohesive, not just for you, but like when you're looking back on it, like after the exam, or like when you're like checking your work, it kind of presents it in a more kind of visible way, like visual.
Very easy to access. So you're saying from the perspective of the marker, just like show them what they need to see in as easy to see way as possible, right? So you're saying you would actually do dot point answers in the exam?
Yeah. For particularly questions where it would say like a definition and then give some examples, it would be like, oh, giving the definition and then examples include, and then maybe like 1 to 3 dot points, like, and the dot points, it would be, say I was giving an example like gene therapy, go like a colon, then kind of going into it more so in a sentence structure, so it wasn't exactly losing that sentence structure, but just kind of breaking it up in a different way.
Got it. So it's not like one word on the dot points. You were still kind of saying them as if they were a full sentence, but it forced you to be quite concise. Awesome. And what about like 3 markers, 4 markers? What was the trick there? And were you someone who often went over the lines provided, or did you find you were always trying to keep it within the lines?
I have pretty big handwriting, so I found that like going over the lines was it wasn't necessarily a problem, I would say, but it was kind of more like it was a bit of yeah, absolutely. So I definitely recommend, like, if you want to go more in depth, like absolutely feel free to do so. And if you are like, when you are in the exam, like feel free to ask for extra booklets. Like it's definitely good if you want to kind of go more in depth or discuss it more in depth.
I mean, yeah, it sounds like we've had other students say that they were actually told to kind of go over the lines to make their responses sound longer. Admittedly, that wasn't necessarily in this particular subject, but I think some people get told not to go over the lines, but it's not like, I just wanted to hear it because it will reassure people that going over and using other space is okay. And I suppose we just qualify that by like, don't write everything you know on the topic just because you want to show that off, right? Like if it's 3 marks, would you say it's like making 3 points on the thing, or it just depends on the type of question?
I think it depends on the type of question, but definitely for many of the questions, like you can be given like giving 3 points, like a mark, like a point per mark kind of. We were told the guideline of around like 3 to 4 lines per mark. I don't know whether that applies for every single question, but I found for like quite a few of the questions we were asked, it kind of helped as well for just to offer like explanations.
And would you go out of your way to provide examples? Like how important were examples, even if the question didn't explicitly ask for that?
Definitely, I definitely recommend doing examples. Like even if the question doesn't ask for it, it does show that you're able to apply like the scientific concept you're discussing, and you're able to kind of use that in a particular way. Like it definitely helps kind of bolster your argument and make it stronger, and make it it makes your response like
More
it kind of
detailed.
adds to it. Absolutely.
Right. And in terms of your preparation, like I was going to say, the other thing about going over the lines is that needs to be qualified by an understanding that you don't want to waste time and fall short of completing the paper, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
what was your kind of process there with practicing? Like how many papers do you think you did before the HSC and before trials? And did you time yourself, and how did you manage time, and how did you kind of foresee how much time you would have per question?
I can't remember the exact number of practice exams that I did like before trials and before the HSC, but I just tried to do as many as possible. I wasn't the type of person that like liked timing, doing timed responses or like timed exams, just because I found that that would kind of stress me out like just before the HSC, and I didn't want that because then I would kind of start freaking out over it and like overthinking. So it was definitely kind of more in a casual way, like saying, okay, this is what could be on the exam. Like this is the kind of thing that you need to be aware of. And in times where like I was particularly struggling with a question, I would like check what like the solutions kind of said, like, use that as a guideline, and then kind of formulate my response with that like structure or those examples or that explanation in mind. So it definitely wasn't like, oh, you've got to like consciously active like recall like all the time. It was like, okay, you can like refer to your notes when you need to, and like seek out like those solutions if you need to, like over time. And then that kind of helped as well, like going into more responses and like being aware of what I need to look for and how I need to like answer it.
Yes, great. And how important was memorization, if at all, in this process? Because it sounds like you're going through this very like natural process of looking back at your notes, applying them again. You're probably naturally going to remember more and more throughout that. But was there any explicit process for you of memorizing and making sure, hey, I just need to know these 3 examples for this topic. I need to know this definition. Talk us through that.
I used flashcards particularly for definitions, not like all of the time, but especially for ones that I really needed to work on. Like I would create like a little pile of flashcards and just kind of go through them when need be. But in terms of memorization, that's where I kind of found the talking through it helped as well. Like kind of talking through it, being able to get it into my head, like even handwriting responses and then looking over them and like handwriting different responses that are kind of similar. It's just a lot of like kind of,
it's practice. But no, I understand. So when you're saying you're like talking through it though, so people can understand, are you talking through it without looking at your notes?
Yeah, like talking through it without looking at notes, or like putting the notes behind me, and then like if I was really struggling or I like couldn't find the words, or like I went off track, I would kind of take a little look at them, like kind of read over what it was, and then put them back behind me and keep on going. Even kind of like a look, cover, write, check sort of situation.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, that's definitely.
It never gets old. It always works.
It always works. It's like foolproof. It helps majorly. So I definitely recommend that one.
Okay, awesome. No, that's a very good tip. Do you have any other tips in terms of collecting notes? I feel like with bio, it's something that people could make hundreds of pages of notes for. You've already mentioned a few ways to simplify it and condense it through like tables and flowcharts and things like that. But do you want to just run us through a list of ways that you think someone could go about, getting all of the content down without having hundreds of pages of notes?
As much as I do recommend like kind of seeking out as much as you can, like as much as possible, kind of providing yourself like, I guess, maybe limiting yourself to like a couple of solid examples like per kind of concept or like per dot point, like so that you're able to kind of get through them in detail and elaborate on them and apply them solidly and cohesively like within an argument. And getting that in-depth knowledge as well will help like with the application of that particular concept as well.
Yes, and it sounds like just a huge part of that, and a part of the answer there is just focusing on applying and having some base notes, but really talking through points yourself without looking, doing past questions, and then only look in if you have to. I mean, that sounds like that was like the key to your approach. In terms of biology as a subject, if we're talking about the content itself, what did you find to be the hardest topic? Because I know there's like 4 modules. What did you find to be the hardest module or even subtopic just to get your head around?
Non-infectious diseases, module 8. The last module was definitely the one that kind of took me the most time to like get my head around, particularly with things like homeostasis. And I think we did, was it the ears, the eyes, and the kidneys? Those 3 kind of took a lot of time for me to like understand and memorize, particularly the ear. I remember like the whole anatomy of the ear, the different kinds of implants. That was the one that I kind of dedicated the most time to trying to get down and trying to memorize.
Any particular insights that you now have on those topics or other things for students who are trying to get through that now?
Look, cover, write, check. That's when it came in. Definitely for like, I remember the ears at least, like flashcards in terms of discussing like the different kinds of implants, the cochlear implant, I think it was the conduction implant, like those 3, using flashcards and flowcharts to kind of gain an understanding of the process in a chronological order, trying to focus with those ones in particular on memorization and getting that down, so that when it comes to an exam and if you are examined on that, like having that knowledge of it, having that knowledge of the process, so that like maybe you have to write that down or like apply it, like getting that, just kind of getting that like ingrained and down and understood.
Yeah, it's almost like a safety net sometimes as well, like just memorizing these definitions that even if you don't fully grasp it, at least gives you a base, and then, you know, over time you can kind of build on that, or maybe the question kind of guides you on where you need to go with it, but at least you've got that platform, and that way you're not fretting from sentence 1. It's like, okay, no, I've memorized some of these definitions because I found this really hard, so I'm going to start with those and then build off that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like getting those definitions down, like getting as much as you can down from it, like as the question kind of allows you to do. And that's definitely where like definitions come in handy. If you find a question that is a little bit tough or is something that maybe you're like not as confident about, like at least having that definition down, it's a good starter. Many times it like helps you kind of understand what the question is asking you, and it gives you that time to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the question as well.
Awesome. And a couple of quick questions for you before we wrap up. Before the HSC, how many weeks did you start really going hard in terms of the study before the exams? I know you guys had an extended start date, but how many weeks before until you did that, and therefore how many weeks did you kind of have a break after trials, if that makes sense? And if you could follow that up with how would you study in those days? Were you doing 2 subjects per day and rotating? Just your insights on that.
I think I gave myself a week after trials, I believe, just to kind of do nothing, like let my brain kind of relax. I tried to like read and like really focus on like other hobbies and not like kind of let like the worries of the HSC take a backseat in that time. I think from what I remember, it was around like 5 to 6 weeks before, just kind of getting myself back into it, like getting into a rhythm, getting into a routine. On like days where I would do a couple of subjects, I would write down a to-do list of different things I wanted to do like per subject. Say I was doing like English and then bio, and if I could like maybe a little bit of history, like saying, okay, for English, I want to do like this practice response. Like I want to get down, maybe like write down 1 essay or like 1 practice essay. For bio, I want to do maybe work on this specific dot point, do this specific like part of an exam, like whether it be like multiple choice or like short answers or extended responses, and then kind of following that sort of routine for like as many subjects as I could, like within a day, but also saying, okay, if I can't finish everything, that's okay. Like it was definitely a more intuitive process where it was like, if you can't do something, like that's okay, take a breather, take a walk. Like you don't have to finish everything, and don't like be so hard on yourself.
Yes, and it does sound like you did really take that stress-free approach. Like even what you were saying before with didn't want to overwhelm myself with timed exams and things like that, you know, keeping the cortisol down, keeping yourself as relaxed as possible. But that stuff all helps, because that can lead to huge, you know, mental blocks in the exam when you put that much pressure on yourself. So I think that's a really important point and a good one to kind of wrap up with, that you shouldn't beat yourself up if you have a bad day of study. obviously map out a schedule and try and stick to it as closely as possible, but probably not set in more, like people are often overly ambitious with what they think they can achieve in one day. But, you know, as they say, they kind of think they can do more than they really can in a day, but they probably think they can do less than they can in the year, right? So you've got to kind of think about things as a marathon versus a sprint, and that way you won't burn out and you won't put so much pressure on yourself, and you can actually perform better that way in the exams. And that ties back to what we began with, you know, have actually something that you're going to look forward to, plan for after. Obviously, don't get too distracted by it, but have something booked in, have a plan there, and that way, you know, you can kind of retreat to Fantasyland when you're feeling overwhelmed, and then get back to work and just know that it's going to be over fairly soon, sooner than you think. Diana, thank you so much. Do you have any final departing thoughts for the viewers out there who are going through it? I mean, you just gave some really good insights there about, you know, not beating yourself up, but any other words that you'd like to leave on?
You've got this, just like do the best you can. Kind of enjoy year 12 as much as you can. It's like kind of cherish those memories and
do the best you can, but in savor the moment, right, as well. Like, it actually is a very unique time, and it's a shared, you know, if it's a struggle, it's a shared struggle, at least with your peers. Absolutely. And it's one of the last times you'll be with that many people like the same age as you for, you know, all day, every day. Like, you're not going to have that again. You'll have uni, which is a little bit different, still similar, and it only gets to be like less the case as you get older. So cherish the memories, cherish the experience, even though it can be hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you've got this, you're like all in this together, like asking your teachers for help. Absolutely. Like, use the support system that you have, and like to kind of push through, and and the end is in sight. Like,
that's it.
You're almost there. You're on the home stretch.
Awesome. Well said. All right. Thank you so much, Diana, for joining us today. We appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for watching. If you did enjoy this chat, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.